All right, so we are, today is Friday. Can we have no more conversation in the room, please? Thank you. Today is Friday, January 27th, 2023. This is the second half of the Senate Natural Resources and Energy morning session. And we are picking up on S5, briefly known as the Affordable Heat Act, and talking this morning with Chair Whiting, staff attorney with the Conservation Law Foundation. So good to see you again, Mr. Whiting. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you, Chair.
And congratulations to you on your baby.
Thank you. Yeah, I should say to everybody, if I seem a little tired and off, it's because I am tired and off. We have a newborn at home, and we're not getting a lot of sleep these days. Thank you, Chair Bray. So I have a presentation which I believe is posted online, but I printed off copies.
Thank you.
For you all. And I was hoping to more or less just run through that using it as a guidepost for our conversation today. And please at any time stop me if you have any questions, clarifying or otherwise. I'm quite familiar with the Affordable Heat Act and its predecessor, the Clean Heat Standard. And so we'd be really happy to engage at any point in any of the details and any questions you might have. So as Chair Bray said, my name is Chase Whiting. I'm with Conservation Law Foundation. I work on the clean energy and climate change team there. CLF has been around for a while now, since 1966, and we have, in more recent years, implemented greenhouse gas mitigation requirements, or worked to implement greenhouse gas mitigation requirements across New England. We've been successful in Maine, Vermont, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. And so here in Vermont, of course, we know those mandatory greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements as the Global Warming Solutions Act. And it's just a tremendous opportunity that we now have to dig into that law and what it can help the state achieve. So I'm preaching to the choir perhaps when I say this, and I don't need to belabor at this point with the folks in this committee. But as you know, climate change is already detrimental to Vermont. We're seeing shorter winters, less snow cover. We're seeing more variable sugaring seasons, more tick-borne illnesses, acute drought, extreme storms that are causing more property damage and are risking people's health and well-being. The impacts are already here, and if we don't work quickly to reduce climate pollution, the impacts will only accelerate. And so Vermont has an opportunity to do its part in achieving the goals and the requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act. And that's really what I wanted to talk about today in the context of the Affordable Heat Act.
Can I ask you a question on that? It's a friendly question. It might not sound like it at first, but it's because I'm channeling the kind of things that we get as legislators. And that is, people say, oh, okay, so maybe these things are true about what climate change is doing to Vermont. But even if we make a full-fledged effort here in Vermont, our efforts won't mitigate these larger patterns. So how do you, I mean, I have my own answer, but I'm curious as to how you respond to that challenge.
I respond to it in a couple of ways. The first way that I say is that we're all in this together. This is a global problem. And so every jurisdiction needs to do its part. No jurisdiction gets a free pass. We've signed up to do our part in Vermont by passing the Global Warming Solutions Act. And really, we have an opportunity as Vermonters to lead in this space. And so we have an obligation as citizens of the world to do so. And I believe that obligation is moral. But I also think that it's, frankly, an obligation that we owe to our children and to our grandchildren. The future that they will inherit from us is not the past that we have known growing up and living. It will be remarkably different in very harmful ways. And so we need to do our part. And I'd add to that New England and Vermont are laboratories for change, and that people across the country, other jurisdictions, other states are watching. And so we have to note too that our influence can be far more expansive than even the borders of our state.
Some of the most, I guess, sobering feedback I've heard at one level about impact of climate change is talking to younger Vermonters who've chosen not to have children because they're too concerned about the environment they would bring those kids up in. And so I know that's a especially sensitive topic for you right now, but that kind of qualitative feedback is hard to use, but I think it's heartfelt and sobering.
And it's something that I personally struggled with. And so I feel like it's very spot on for a lot of people in the millennial generation. And with a newborn at home, I have to say that I think about climate change every day, multiple times every day, in ways I haven't before, because of the impact it will have on her life. So yeah, it's a spot on observation, Senator. Thank you. So I'm going to move forward a little bit to talk about some of the nuts and bolts of the Global Warming Solutions Act itself in the context of the Affordable Heat Act. And so I'm on this page of my handout in case that's helpful, which has the text of the Global Warming Solutions Act, a portion of it, which is found in 10 VSA section 578. That's where the greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements reside in the Vermont statutes. And I just wanted to call out some salient points there. The first is that when the Global Warming Solutions Act was enacted, it made some really important modifications to the law, where, as you can see, the old language is there in strikeouts. The greenhouse gas emission reduction targets that we now have used to be goals, and they were explicitly transformed into requirements. And another thing that's important to note is that within the language of the law that we now have, that is the Global Warming Solutions Act, we've made a commitment to reduce emissions here in Vermont, but also the emissions that are caused outside of the state because of the energy we use in Vermont. Those are sometimes referred to as upstream emissions or life cycle emissions. You know, those are like the emissions from refining the fossil fuel, transporting the fossil fuel, those types of things that happen along the chain before it gets here to Vermont. And I wanted to note those because the Affordable Heat Act, as it is before this committee right now, is designed to address both of those types of emissions, both the emissions in the state of Vermont and those upstream emissions, the life cycle emissions that occur outside of the state because of energy that we use in the state of Vermont. So there's a real synergy there that I think is important to note, because sometimes that gets missed in the conversations.
I'm reassured to see that the original language was thoughtful enough to include those external impacts.
Yes, sir. I agree. I also you've heard this point, I don't want to belabor it, but the thermal sector in Vermont is about 1/3 of our overall greenhouse gas emissions. It's a huge chunk. And so the state desperately needs policies that will proactively and meaningfully reduce carbon pollution in the thermal sector. And the Affordable Heat Act, if well designed, could be the type of policy that would achieve that outcome. So some have recently said, I've heard said in the context of the Affordable Heat Act conversations, that the state should delay action on meaningful climate solutions, whether with the Affordable Heat Act or really with any climate action. And on that point, I just want to note, in light of the Global Warming Solutions Act and its requirements, that on our current trajectory, Vermont is all but certain to miss the 2025 and 2030 carbon pollution reduction requirements. If we continue with business as usual, we are all but certain to miss those targets. 2025 is fast approaching, it's less than 2 years away, and 2030 is only a couple of years after that. If we delay any further, it's going to have the effect of placing those greenhouse gas emission reduction targets completely out of reach. And so, in response to some who would say that we need to wait, we need to delay, I would say that the time to act was yesterday. We are out of time. Delay is not an option anymore. We need to proceed. We cannot delay because today's decisions are going to help determine tomorrow's emissions. If you think about it, just from sort of a practical perspective, installing a heating system today, you're going to likely have that heating system for at least another 20 years or so. And so what that heating system might be will determine the emissions from that heating system for the next 20 or so years, which would put us well beyond 2030. And so in that way, I think it's important to remember that the decisions that folks are making today, that policies can help them make today, will determine the emissions that are coming from their homes in 2030 and beyond. So, for example, installing new infrastructure that combusts fossil fuels that pollute carbon pollution, if we are incentivizing or allowing those things to occur today, we're going to have to live with the consequences of those emissions for a long time to come. I think we've all heard those types of things described before in other contexts as locking in emissions, and it's real, which is why we cannot delay. Today's decisions really will help determine tomorrow's emissions.
Yeah, John Erickson, yeah, we refer to that as carbon lock-in. That was the term.
Which, as I understand it, is a concept that has received a lot of scholarly attention and certainly has been well investigated and published. We cannot delay for another reason, because the decisions that we make today are going to determine tomorrow's costs. I'm now on the next page of my presentation, which includes this bar 13 citing from research from the Energy Innovation and Policy Technology Institute. If we continue to buy and build polluting power plants and infrastructure and install it today, what we're looking at are steeper costs tomorrow. You can think about this in a couple of ways. For example, you can think about it if somebody in their home were to just go ahead and install a polluting piece of equipment today. And then in 2030, when we have to unequivocally get serious about climate change, were to install another piece of new equipment, they're essentially making the same investment twice. And that's expensive for that homeowner, for that individual. Another way to think of it is, if we wait as a society, as a state, until 2030 or later to make investments, to reach the greenhouse gas reduction requirements we have to, it means we're going to have to make many, many, many investments in a very short period of time, which means we're going to have a very steep curve to climb. A lot of investments very fast. And that's not easy. It's far easier if we start sooner, so we can make investments in a gradual, stepped process. It can help save individuals money, it can help save the state money. It certainly presents a more reasonable way of engaging these types of decisions. On the next page, I wanted to highlight too that we cannot delay, because today's decisions are also going to determine tomorrow's equity. I pulled a couple of quotes from the Global Warming Solutions Act, language passed by this legislature, to note that the legislature of Vermont has already determined that delaying action on climate will increase costs. That finding's already been made. The legislature has also already determined that historically marginalized groups, lower moderate income Vermonters, are going to disproportionately bear the burdens of climate change. And so calls for delay create a real risk that if the state does not take action in a timely manner, more historically marginalized Vermonters and low and moderate income Vermonters are going to bear ever greater harms and burdens and costs. Whereas acting today in an equitable way can help to alleviate those. Delay is really not an option. The good news is, as described on the next page, where I quote from Vermont's Comprehensive Energy Plan, the good news is that the state has actually already identified the ultimate climate solution pathways that need to be taken. So I have a quote here from the Department of Public Services Comprehensive Energy Plan, which was published last year. And I wanted to highlight it because I think it's important to keep in mind. The department determined that all decarbonization scenarios to meet 2030 and 2050 targets, they share some common features, which are described right here in this quote. Deep decarbonization of the electric sector, coupled with electrification of the thermal sector and the transportation sector. So like in just sort of plain English terms, clean, renewable electricity, lots of it, whole climate heat pumps, electric vehicles. That is the ultimate solution that is consistent across all of the pathways that the state investigated and identified in its comprehensive energy plan, that the Climate Council has identified as well. And so On that point, it's very important that any policy, including the Affordable Heat Act, incentivize clean thermal electrification and make sure that that clean thermal electrification is accessible to all Vermonters, especially Vermonters living with low and moderate incomes.
The use of electricity is a clean fuel, but we are currently under the renewable energy standard. We, our portfolio is, I don't know we're making progress towards the 75% renewable by 2030 goal. I think we're at roughly 65% at this point, which leaves 35% need not be, it's my hope that in addition to doing this work, that we'll revisit the renewable energy standard in the near future and look to accelerate the cleaning of our grid so that the transition is even more meaningful and more rational.
Thank you, Senator. I'm glad that you brought that up. I agree. I think a reform of the renewable energy standard, frankly, is the linchpin to making sure that all of the other climate solutions that we're talking about work. In order to make heat pumps, cold climate heat pumps, and electric vehicles truly be clean solutions, the electricity they're running on needs to be truly clean. And so 100% clean renewable electricity and lots of new clean renewable electricity to meet the new demands, the new load that's going to be required is going to be really important. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Senator. I appreciate that. Of course, Senator, thanks. So with that, sort of setting the table, I actually wanted to jump into the Affordable Heat Act a little bit and create a space to share some of my thoughts, but then also create a space to receive any questions you might have. So the first thing I want to say is that a well-designed Affordable Heat Act should accomplish several things. Conservation Law Foundation has long talked about these sorts of things. The first is that it really ought to provide Vermonters, especially Vermonters living with low and moderate income, access to installation measures like cold climate heat pumps and weatherization. Things that will truly reduce their costs of heating their homes, make their homes warmer, healthier, and safer. Second, they must limit the harms caused by combustion measures. I'll get more into in a minute. Third, it really needs to incentivize those things that we know are necessary to meet the greenhouse gas reduction requirements, which are clean electrification and weatherization. Those things need to be front and center because we know that that is what is necessary to actually rise to this challenge. Fourth, we have to ensure that carbon pollution is accurately counted and that it is also meaningfully reduced. We need to do our accounting, right? Know what we got and then reduce it by the amounts we need to reduce it. And finally, we need to ensure that environmental standards are followed when we're rolling a clean heat standard out, or excuse me, Affordable Heat Act out.
Senator White.
Thank you, Chairman Bright. I realize I maybe should have asked this question right before you dived into this section,
Yeah.
but one of the concerns, questions that has been raised by the administration is that our 2050 goals are really what we should be shooting, our 2050 requirements are really what we should be shooting for and not necessarily our 2030 requirements. I would love if you could comment on that, and that is one of the things that they have rhetorically talked about with the Affordable Heat Act and how it may be prioritizing 2030 over 2050 as well. So I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
Thank you, yeah, and I'd be happy to. My comment has two parts. The first is sort of harkening back to some of the things I said a moment ago. If we delay, we can expect climate solutions which are necessary to harm lower and moderate income and historically minority communities even more. They have until now disproportionately borne the brunt of climate inaction, and if inaction continues, those harms could include things like drought, disease, increased cost of living as more folks migrate to the Northeast away from climate-stricken regions of the country. These things will become ever more pervasive. And so delay could increase inequality in our society, so isn't an acceptable strategy at this point. Delay too could increase costs for the reasons that we described before. Folks might have to make more investments faster in a shorter time frame, really putting strains on state budgets when a stepped, responsible planning process by the state to lay out a policy now and run it through its course over the many years between now and 2050 would be a much wiser fiscal decision than waiting a long time to roll out a big policy. I'd also note too, and this is sort of the second thing that I'd say, that if you look at research, I don't have this in my presentation, but if you look at research that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has done, including its 2018 report, I believe the title was 1.5 degrees Celsius. The title of the report was a special report found in 2018. They model scenarios in which we delay meaningful greenhouse gas emission reductions. And the longer we delay those reductions, it increases the amount of carbon we need to suck out of the atmosphere and sequester to stay at 1.5 degrees Celsius, or rather to return to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that is frankly an extraordinary challenge that I would much rather just avoid and reduce greenhouse gas emissions now so that we don't have to then in 10 years be in a conversation of how do we suck all of this carbon out of the atmosphere to get back to 1.5. So from those perspectives, costs, equity, just frankly getting things done in a way that's going to be workable is a common solution. I really don't believe that this delaying and shooting for 2050 as target rather than 2030 is really a viable option.
Thank you, Chairman Bray. I really appreciate your testimony so far. And another concern that we've heard is the framing that moving forward with the Affordable Heat Act as it stands would be poor governance. And that good governance would actually be to do more analysis and more detailed research on something like a clean heat standard. And I'm wondering if you could speak to, in your expert opinion, if we do have enough data and analysis and an understanding to move forward with this as an outside perspective.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that question, Senator Wade. Thank you very much. I do. I have a couple of thoughts about that. The first of which is that the argument that I have heard you make that we need to collect more data before we can roll out an Affordable Heat Act in particular, I believe is a bit of a red herring, not really an issue. And I think that for the following reasons. The bill itself, as it is now before the committee, it creates authority for the Public Utility Commission to gather such information. In fact, it creates a requirement that the Public Utility Commission shall do so. And it creates a requirement that the PUC shall annually share that information with both the Agency of Natural Resources and the Department of Public Services, so that the Affordable Heat Act can be administered appropriately, and so that ANR and DPS can administer their relevant programs. So there's already language in the law that would in fact allow the state to gather that information. That's the first sort of subpoint there. The second subpoint there is that we've got a couple of years before the Affordable Heat Act rolls out. And so we have a couple of years to do what the law already says we have to do, which is gather that information. And so we've got time to do it. We've got time to do that work. And the third sort of subpoint is there's some redundancies built in the provision of the Affordable Heat Act that says, talks about the check back reports. There are two reports, one in 2024 and one in 2025, in which the Public Utility Commission has an opportunity to alert the legislature of any shortcomings. And those would be wonderful opportunities in the process already contemplated in the bill for the commission to say to the legislature, you know, there are some inadequacies in how we're collecting data. Could you please help us by tweaking the law or enacting some additional language? And so there are going to be two opportunities before the law goes into effect to actually fix it. So long and short, if you want to look at the specific provisions in sections 8124 B1 through 4 and 8124H, and then in section 5A or 5I, you'll see that in all of those places, the law already, or the bill already contemplates the Public Utility Commission having the authority to collect all the data necessary to administer the program and to share it with the relevant agencies.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for that. The other opportunity that I would have that list for review prior to program launch is that we have a full legislative session in order to look at the final rule as an entire General Assembly. So there'll be plenty of reporting, and then a full legislative session for review prior to launch. So,
Yeah, thank you. That's a great additional point, Chair Bray. I appreciate that. You're absolutely right. Any other questions or no? I've got a couple more things I want to say, and there's plenty of opportunities to ask more questions. Okay, then I'll circle back to the Affordable Heat Act itself and to those 5 points that I was talking about a moment ago. I just want to note that compared to last year's Clean Heat Standard, the Affordable Heat Act does contain some really important advances. And they are relevant to those 5 areas that I described a moment ago. So last year's Clean Heat Standard contemplated that 32% of clean heat measures would go to low and moderate income Vermonters. That's a good measure. This year's Affordable Heat Act contemplates that half of those would come from installation measures such as cold climate heat pumps and weatherization. That's a really good improvement. That helps to ensure that low and moderate income Vermonters are gaining access to types of thermal options that will reduce their costs of heating, lead to a climate solution by reducing greenhouse gas emissions meaningfully, help make their homes warmer and healthier. The second thing I wanted to note is that in terms of limiting the harms caused by combustion measures, the Affordable Heat Act contemplates a carbon intensity phase down over time, which will have the effect of limiting the harmful biofuels that had more prominence in the Clean Heat Standard. And ensure that over time we're only using the cleanest of those fuels, which is an important addition. The Affordable Heat Act also includes new incentives for clean electrification measures, things like rooftop and community scale solar, paired with heat pumps, networking grid geothermal, efficient home appliances with thermal end uses, like heat pump, hot water heaters, dryers, stoves. These are important measures, all of them, all of the many additions in the space of electrification to help us achieve the steps we know we need to take. We know we need to deeply decarbonize the thermal sector with clean electricity, clean electric thermal options, and those additions help to do that. The other thing that I wanted to note is that the Affordable Heat Act contains provisions that help to create more accurate greenhouse gas emissions accounting, an important addition to the current requirements of the greenhouse gas inventory that would create what in the biz some folks refer to as a sensitivity analysis, which will be additional to, not a replacement of, but additional to the greenhouse gas inventory, so that we're tracking accurately and transparently the emissions from things like biofuels, which right now in the inventory are considered incorrectly to be zero CO2.
Can you say a little more about sensitivity analysis? I think questions have come up a couple times, so I know it's something I'm learning about and want to understand a little better.
Absolutely. And so I'd say it's a term of art, and perhaps it's not the most artful term of art. And so there are probably better terms that could be used, and this committee in its wisdom, I'm sure, could come up with a better term if you all wanted to. But typically, sensitivity analysis, when it's thought of in the context of greenhouse gas accounting, it's thought of as an additional tool that's used in an inventory, a greenhouse gas inventory. It doesn't replace what the inventory currently does, but it adds to an inventory additional information. So let me unpack that just a little bit. The current greenhouse gas inventory looks at biofuels, and it assumes that they are zero CO2. And so it measures other emissions from them that aren't CO2, such as methane, nitrous oxide, things like that. But it doesn't look at the CO2. It assumes to be zero. And so if there were an Affordable Heat Act implemented with the current inventory, and a home that was currently burning fossil fuels but switched to biofuels would look in the inventory as if that home had reduced its CO2 pollution 100%. That wouldn't be accurate because we know the biofuels, like fossil fuels, have upstream life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, just like the sort that, as I pointed out earlier, the GWSA contemplates us reducing. We know that creating the biofuels, that process has emissions, refining them produces emissions, transporting them, storing them, all has emissions. And so a sensitivity analysis would look at those upstream emissions so that in the greenhouse gas inventory, you all, as policymakers, could look at the inventory and say, here are the accurate greenhouse gas emission reductions we have achieved, rather than looking at an inventory that assumes wrongly that all biofuels are zero CO2. So it provides additional information, additional context, and it helps us sort of accurately track our progress.
So is one way to think of it that we move from a sort of a focus on something like burner tip emissions to the full life cycle emissions related to any particular fuel?
That's accurate, yeah, but the one caveat that I know is that it doesn't contemplate a full-scale replacement of looking at burner tip emissions, because that would still occur in the greenhouse gas emissions inventory, but it would provide additional information sort of next to that analysis so that we could see the full life cycle carbon dioxide emissions of the biofuels. So we have two sets of information, burner tip and life cycle, and we can look at both simultaneously.
Any other questions on this one? Senator White.
Thank you, Chairman Bray. One of the, I really appreciate how you're framing it up and using some very, you're talking to me like a lawyer, and I love it.
I can't help it, I'm so sorry.
No, it's good.
It's
It's
ingrained
good.
at this point.
What I feel that Representative McCormick and I have heard from constituents in particular is a concern that by, even with a carbon intensity score, that we will be using the rainforests of other countries, or the or we will be slashing and burning in other parts of the world to meet our climate requirements. But what I'm hearing from you is that's not what we would be doing, because the carbon intensity score of those biofuels would make them very unproductive for a dealer to choose as a way to meet their credit requirement. Is that another way to frame that?
Yeah, it could be. I think, that topic, to really dive into it, it's a deep one.
Okay.
And it sort of requires a macroeconomic approach, which is, as I understand it, that's the sort of argument of how using a biofuel in one jurisdiction, even a clean one, can lead to harms in another jurisdiction because the economy is fluid. However, the carbon intensity scale down that is contemplated in this Affordable Heat Act is one that would have several benefits that I think are really meaningful. The first is it looks at that scale down using the full, I think I saw the term up on the board earlier. I might be mistaken, but yeah, the fuel pathway, there it is. It does the scale down based on a fuel pathway analysis, which is consistent with other jurisdictions, such as Oregon, who are implementing similar policies. And that analysis looks at the emissions from every single step of the creation of the biofuel. The feedstock that's used, corn, soy, whatever it might be, manure, all the way to the fuel itself and its combustion. And so additional tighter, more accurate greenhouse gas accounting measures, sort of plus that fuel pathways analysis, it helps provide a pretty clear sense of what the emissions are from a particular biofuel. Doesn't necessarily answer the macroeconomic question. It doesn't try to, but it does look at the emissions from that bioenergy. And so if over time, the carbon intensity phases down, we know that the bioenergies we are using in Vermont, to the extent we're using any, are going to be cleaner and cleaner and cleaner until ultimately we're using the very cleanest. And so you can take that to the bank, but there are certainly, other larger questions that I think scholars will talk about for a long time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You were going through changes in S5 relative to 7.5, some improvements you were sort of enumerating. since we took you off track a little bit.
I have only one more I wanted to draw your attention to. And that's just, and it's a relatively simple one. But last year's Clean Heat Standard, I think rather unintentionally, but it undercut the environmental impact assessment that's a requirement of the rulemaking process. It's a bedrock environmental principle in the rulemaking process that's been around for a long time. And I'm happy that the current version of the Affordable Heat Act has restored in full the environmental impact analysis part of the rulemaking process. And so that too is an important provision that helps to ensure that environmental standards are followed in the Affordable Heat Act is rolled out.
What, clarity, what did you say, undermined there?
The word that I used there was undercut.
No, what, you talk about the last year's effort, which did not pass, or you talking about the?
That one last year. So
Okay.
last year's Clean Heat Standard contained some language that sort of undercut the effectiveness, or really whether or not.
So it's not like we have a problem that we have to fix something.
No, it's already been fixed. The current version of the Affordable Heat Act has fixed that problem.
And can you just say a little more about that? Like, what is it that's going, where will that environmental impact analysis show up? What part of the bill drives it, and does it also fit in with the rulemaking that's required?
Good question. So the environmental impact assessment occurs during the rulemaking process. And the Affordable Heat Act contemplates the Public Utility Commission issuing rules and orders, and gives express jurisdiction to the Public Utility Commission to issue rules. And so when they engage in a rulemaking process, one of the things they're going to have to do is an environmental impact assessment. They're going to have to make sure that the policies they're choosing don't have unintended harmful consequences on things like air quality, water quality, things like that. And so last year's bill contained some language that made it very questionable whether or not the PC would actually have to engage in environmental impact assessment. It read as if they were being given permission not to engage in environmental impact assessment. That language is gone, and so the Affordable Heat Act now contemplates rulemaking as it's supposed to occur, which would include environmental impact assessment. So a really beneficial change.
Thank you for that. And I think the other piece that goes hand in glove with that is the economic impact analysis too, that's required by full formal rulemaking.
That's true. So in sum, the Affordable Heat Act has made some really important advances compared to last year's Clean Heat Standard. Those things that I just mentioned before. I'd say that our work is not done. In particular, I really look forward to working with members of this committee and other legislators on helping to make sure that installation measures like cold climate heat pumps and weatherization are made accessible to all Vermonters, in particular Vermonters with low and moderate income. And so in the coming days and weeks, hopefully not months, but perhaps we'll see, we can engage in some conversations around some policy options there, things like tariff-bound bill financing that would allow folks, regardless of their income, regardless of their credit, regardless of whether they're a homeowner or a renter, to get access to things like cold climate heat pumps and weatherization.
You remind me when you sort of on the tariffs that financing, we should get a mini presentation on the RAP, because we worked on it here 2 years ago. Now that program's in the pilot phase and rolling out. And although the bill doesn't speak to it directly, I think it weighs on everyone's mind. How will we make? We know we need to make an investment. We're acknowledging that and embracing it. We're also trying to make that investment as affordable as possible. So thanks for bringing that wrap back up, and we'll get those testimony.
I appreciate that. And let me just say that I do think that the Affordable Heat Act does contain some really important provisions that do increase access to cold climate heat pumps and weatherization installation measures for low and moderate income Vermonters. I've highlighted a few. There are others, like how the designated delivery agent would be obligated to use compliance payments to provide measures for low and moderate income Vermonters. There are multiple others in the bill. So they're there. And we know that installing heat pumps and weatherization does save people money. Folks who are burning fossil fuels like kerosene or propane or oil, or that switch does save people money. Weatherization means they're burning fewer fuels, which means they're spending less money as well. And so we know that there are real and meaningful savings that are out there. I'm really contemplating hoping to take an additional step to really make sure that we are providing full access to all Vermonters to those installation measures. How are we doing on time, Chair Brian?
We have about 15 minutes.
15?
Yeah.
There's one other thing I wanted to sort of speak to. And I'm happy to reserve time for questions, but also wrap up early and I want to take an early lunch. I get that too.
We have the floor then.
I can be brief. I don't need to take up all this time. Very quickly, there's just one other thing I wanted to speak to that I've heard said in some previous testimony, just sort of out in the ether, about greenhouse gas emissions accounting and GREET, the
Yes.
GREET model. I was hoping to just talk about that a little bit. So the current language of the Affordable Heat Act contemplates using a life cycle greenhouse gas emissions accounting methodology, such as GREET or the IPCC, or another that is of similar analytical rigor. And there are a couple things I wanted to unpack there. The first is I've heard what I sort of hear is either a misunderstanding or perhaps sort of a misrepresentation around how life cycle would have to occur in Vermont. Any life cycle model that we use in the state, GREET or otherwise, is going to have to be adapted to fit the Vermont context for a couple of reasons. The first is that that's how you use GREET in other states. That's what other states are already doing. GREET is just like a baseline that's created by the Argonne Labs, the Department of Energy. And when states use it, like California or Oregon, they adapt it to their specific contexts, to their geographies, to the fuels that are in their states, to their own state's specific electricity mix. And Vermont would have to do the same thing. Our electricity is very different than the electricity used in California or Oregon. So we need to, and the fuels that would be used here are very different than those. And so we would have to adapt any life cycle model to fit the Vermont context. It's just a necessity. The second thing that I point out there is that GREET is used in the transportation space. It's not currently used in the thermal space. And so to adapt a model like GREET, we would have to make adaptations or changes to speak to thermal space. We just would have to. So the adaptation, I think, is unavoidable to Vermont specific context and to the thermal context. I also just wanted to note that that language in the bill that talks about alternative models of similar analytical rigor, I think that's really important because GREET is a respected life cycle model among academics and policymakers, but it's not the only one. And life cycle greenhouse gas accounting is hotly studied by academics now. Peer-reviewed research is constantly coming out. The Academies of Sciences, medicine and engineering is consistently reviewing and writing reports. It's an area of progress and advancement. In that language that would allow for other models of similar analytical rigor would allow Vermont to gain the benefit of what we learn as time goes on, as the field progresses, so that we evolve with the field. And so I think it's really important language. It's good policy. It's also, I think, just practical. It's just sort of what we have to do if we wanted to be serious about accurately counting our emissions.
We'll be hearing from Oregon next week, so that we'll coordinate the, I'm not sure, program manager for their clean transportation fuels program. So we'll have a chance to hear about how they adapted GREET and
Wonderful. Yeah, and I know they use fuel pathways there as well, so could absolutely speak to that. So there's certainly a lot more I could say, but I'll stop and see if you all have any questions.
Sorry, Chairman Bright. So one thing we haven't dived into too deeply is the technical advisory group, the TAG.
Yeah.
And One of there seems to be a bit of a debate happening around what we want to see, what out in Vermont, what people expect of a group like the TAG. And I'm wondering if you can speak to, do you feel that the design of the membership, the way we have it in the bill, will accurately reflect the work that we're trying to get them to do? And I think about the point you made with equity, and we want folks to be equitably represented on the TAG, but it's also a highly technical and expert-based group that we're trying to put together. So I'm wondering if you feel we struck a good balance in the bill.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I can't speak to a specific line edit that I would make right now. I certainly could think more about that and prepare for it if you would like me to. I can say this, that the technical advisory group is contemplated to handle some pretty thorny, quantitative, scientific, legal questions, sort of like very technocratic expert kind of stuff. And so the composition of the TAG to meet that challenge would have to include people who are versed in those things. I think it's fundamental. It would be required. That said, the OAP Act also contemplates an equity advisory committee or council, and there I think is a lot to be said about equity speaking to technical policy and technical policy speaking to equity. And I think the two, when they cross-pollinate, when they speak to each other, when they hear each other, is when we get better policy, when we get equity-informed expert policy. And so I think that there are conversations that could be had there.
Okay.
For sure.
Thank you.
And you've mentioned a couple times possible edits. So just for everyone, I think we're taking testimony through next week, and I'm sure we'll probably have some witnesses after as well. But I think after next week, we'll shift over to committee strike all, and we'll work through markup and edits to deliver a bill, which could be as soon as the end of that probably. Not setting a hard fast date, we'll keep on learning as we go, but just for overall shape of what I anticipate we're doing, I think we're getting closer to making a transition to markup. So thanks for teeing that up.
And to be clear, I'm not proposing any changes right now, but if anyone would ever want to talk to them, of course, always available.
Sarah Watson.
No, I don't have any questions. I feel good. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Sarah McCall.
Yeah, I don't know if particularly on this test, but first of all, I want to apologize. I have to step out of the room.
No apology necessary.
I think we at some point, and I'm deviating from this discussion, just a larger discussion. This is the infuriating position of trying to make life economically easier on people and having people angry with us for costing them too much. And it reminds me of 20 years ago when they passed Act 60 and precipitously lowered the property tax rate in Springfield. And I was filled with angry constituents in Springfield. Our taxes are already too high and now you're raising our taxes. I think we need to do a memo to use with our constituents on what Joe and Jane from Hunger are facing if this bill passes. That's it. What it's going to say.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, we're, committee doesn't have weekly press conferences. We don't have access to press in the same way, or they're maybe less interested in talking to us. And so you're absolutely right. We're going to have to work on doing our best to communicate clearly what the benefits of the program that we're contemplating.
And perhaps comparing your economic situation 10 years from now, if the bill passes, your economic situation 10 years from now, if it doesn't.
Looking back, to sort of a bedrock for me, is we have an obligation to act. That's legal. And I think for the moral obligation on top of that is compelling as well. And I think there are many people who want to quote unquote do the right thing, meet that moral obligation. And so I don't consider that a question at all. The only question I feel like we have is what's the most affordable pathway forward? And that has been present in our conversations every single day. And so I appreciate your suggestion to help people understand what that affordable pathway is that we're contemplating. Thank you.
Our current path is unaffordable. It's gonna catch up with us. I mean, just, it's unaffordable.
Already unaffordable.
Yeah.
And what we're dealing with now is largely a function of global warming. The attendant costs.
No, it's a functional good pay. We were engaged in unaffordable good pay.
I don't think those are mutually exclusive propositions.
Right, so it's not a data set, but as I walked the same house yesterday, coming down Court Street, I walked by a guy filling a house up with heating fuel, and I said, "What's the price today?" He said, $5.99. So heating fuels have, well, I'll just say it my way, astronomically expensive.
There's another way in which things are unaffordable today.
So with that, any other questions for our guests?
Even though I was out of the room, I got this, and I appreciate your time.
Just feel free to reach out anytime.
Senator McDonald.
Are you busy? First steps of a possible lawsuit or that we will need in the event that we fail to move forward on this.
I feel like I'm being asked whether Santa Claus is real or not.
Yes.
Conservation Law Foundation is very aware of requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act. We are monitoring very closely what's happening in the Climate Council, in the Agency of Natural Resources, and all of the departments and agencies of government and the legislature. And we're certainly not taking any options off the table.
All right.
Lawyer answer.
All right. Well, so
Thank you.
thank you again for coming in. Good luck getting a little rest in
Yes.
coming weeks and months.
Thank you.
Eventually, babies do sleep through the night.
I'm told that they do eventually, I think. That's what I'm told.
By college, I think, generally, yeah.
I have a really good book that helped us.
Is that right?
Yeah. We
What
have,
is it?
it's called Precious Little Sleep.
Okay.
It's super funny. Anyway, we can talk about it after.
Yeah. That'd be great.
Yeah.
We're looking forward to help you.
Ready?
Johann Sebastian Bach's Goldberg
Can you-
variations.
So we'll start.
Were written.
Let me pause for a moment, sorry.